Hello, and welcome to the Beginning of Wisdom. I'm Andrew Schumacher. Just over 2 years ago, I released several videos discussing the covenants. I did a 3-part series looking at the relationships between the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and New Covenants. Just prior to that, I released this video. This video showed the complete biblical bankruptcy of trying to assert that the New Covenant is actually the renewed covenant. In that video, I played clips from a couple different Hebrew roots teachers on YouTube who were putting forward that view. One was Michael Rood, who has a fairly large following and some pretty decent merchandising going on. The other was John Lawson. Now, after I showed that the argument for renewed is completely bogus, John Lawson's video disappeared from the internet. Anyway, I hadn't checked in on John for quite some time, so I thought I'd see what was going on. And the day that I looked, there was a brand new video about Hebrews 8 and the question of whether Torah commands were abolished by, the coming of the new covenant and things like that. So, of course, I just had to watch. Now, that video is only a little over 5 minutes long, so I think that it's a good one that we can take a look at together and see if John has done a little better than he used to do, if he's learned from the mistakes of the past and is making better content now than he was 2 years ago. So let's go ahead and jump into that video.
Hebrews chapter 8 explained. Many Sunday Christians will say that Hebrews 8 is proof that the Mosaic covenant is abolished, faded away, including keeping the Sabbath and eating clean.
Right off the bat, John is saying that he's going to explain Hebrews chapter 8. Now, that is a whole chapter, and this video is not really very long, so I wonder how he's going to do that. Now, to be fair, most of Hebrews chapter 8 is a citation from Jeremiah 31, the most famous New Covenant citation, where it was given as a prophecy. And that's a large section of the chapter. And he said that he has done another video talking specifically about that. So this is going to be about the other parts of the chapter. What we'll want to see as we listen is whether he deals well with all the difficult statements found at the beginning and end of the chapter where it's not just citing Jeremiah. Let's see what he does.
Yet, when we read Hebrews 8 carefully and take the time to listen to scholars who know the Greek in the original manuscripts, we see that Hebrews 8 is not doing away with the Sabbath or the Mosaic covenant. So what is it saying? Well, let's get started.
So John here is claiming that scholars who know the Greek in original manuscripts show that Hebrews 8 doesn't do away with the Sabbath or Mosaic covenant. There's nothing wrong, of course, with citing relevant authorities, but their conclusions are only as good as the evidence that they present. I'm sure he would agree that we should not rest our conclusions on the conclusions of scholars, but rather test those conclusions. But let's see what John says these scholars have to say.
Let's start with Hebrews 8, verse 6. But now he, that is Yeshua, has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. This is the key point made in this entire chapter. Yeshua has a more excellent ministry, also known as a priesthood, compared to the Levitical. The Melchizedek priesthood in heaven is more excellent than the Levitical priesthood, for Yeshua is perfect and sinless, and the Levitical priesthood is not. This verse and chapter as a whole has nothing to do with doing away with the Sabbath or doing away with eating clean. It has to do with who the mediator is between Israel and Yahweh. Hebrews chapter 8 summarized would say, the imperfect Levitical priesthood as our mediator has been replaced by Yeshua Messiah. And since he's perfect, we are perfect in him, and our sins are cleansed once and for all.
John starts with 8:6. Now, he says that Jesus has a better ministry or priesthood because Jesus is sinless. This isn't wrong, but it also isn't the whole story. Jesus holds his priesthood forever based on the power of an indestructible life. In point of fact, chapter 7 goes deeply into how Jesus' priesthood is not based on the law's requirements of genealogy, but rather based on the promise of God found in Psalm 110. The replacement of the Levitical priests with Jesus is certainly taught in Hebrews, but that's all in chapter 7. I wonder why John's dwelling on that here in Hebrews 8. It does make you think. Also, take note of the text on the graphic here, that he doesn't speak out loud. Annual sacrifices are replaced by one perfect sacrifice. I've noted before that there is a split in the Torah observance movement between those who believe that the animal sacrifices continue and those who believe they have ceased. Whichever stance they take, though, they run up against a big problem. If the sacrifices continue, then the Day of Atonement continues, and there are still animal sacrifices for sin, which contradicts the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ to take away sin and make us perfect. However, John's position seems to be that they ceased with Jesus' sacrifice. There is a change in the law, as it says in Hebrews 7. If this is what John believes, he can't assume continuity anymore. He actually has to argue for the continuation of specific laws, like the Sabbath day. He can't just assume it, since he's already admitted some laws change. I go into this dilemma in more detail in this video here. You can find links to these videos I'm talking about down in the description. Now, let's get to the main event. What John says about the next verse is why I'm making this video.
Now, let's read Hebrews 8, verse 7. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. The word covenant in verse 7 is not found in the original Greek text. This is huge. The original Greek says something like this. For if the first ministry or priesthood, that is, the Levites, had been faultless and perfect, then no place would have been sought for a second priesthood or ministry.
Now, anyone who's looked at the actual Greek of this verse on any side of this debate is now in possession of a shaking head. John, why didn't you learn from the last time you were talking about covenants? Do your homework before you go on the internet making these claims. You clearly didn't check the basic facts on this one. Let's look at the Greek for the two verses he has cited. In verse 6 here in Bible Hub's Interlinear, I want to point out two words to you, ministry here, which is liturgios in Greek, and covenant here, which is diathekes in Greek. Both of these terms are nouns in the genitive case, female gender, and singular. Don't think I'm some sort of big expert for knowing that. It's just what these letters under the word mean. Knowing the case, gender, and number are important for what I'm about to show you concerning verse 7, where his big mistake happens. Here is verse 7 in the Greek Interlinear. The first thing I want to do is ask you to please find what John claimed, that it says something like this, that if the first ministry or priesthood had been faultless. Look at the verse. It's right there. Do you see liturgios? Do you see any word in that verse that is even close to ministry or priesthood? No. If you're paying attention, you're focused on the word translated that in this interlinear. Ekaine is a pronoun, not a proper noun. Literally, it would be rendered something like, for if that first one had been faultless. If you have a Bible that italicizes inserted words, you can see that covenant is italicized in your Bible. It isn't because the translators are trying to hide that it really means priesthood. Rather, it reflects the translator's best guess as to what this pronoun refers to. And this is where case, gender, and number come into play. Often, this is how we know what pronouns refer to, since they refer to whatever they match in these aspects. Ekaine here is nominative female singular. Now, this doesn't match either term, but it's close. Also, there is the difficulty that both ministry and covenant are the same in all three aspects, so even if the pronoun matched, it wouldn't be enough to narrow it down. From the Greek grammar alone, we can't rule out either option. However, we do know that it must be one of them. I'll come back to this at the end with why I believe the translators are right to think that this refers to the covenant. The important thing to keep in mind here, though, is that John didn't tell you any of this. John made the claim that the Greek says something like priesthood. I'm sorry, but that was either a simple lie to fool his viewers or it was complete incompetence. He either knew that was false or he just didn't care to check the Greek at all. Now, I can see how he would get here, though. Hebrew roots and Torah observance teachers often point out the pronoun here and then argue for why it ought to refer to ministry or priesthood. My guess, being as charitable as I can be, is that John just listened to a bunch of this stuff from his teachers and didn't really understand the basis of the argument they were making and decided to summarize it, making this big flub in the process. Whatever happened, John's statement here is demonstrably false, as you have seen. Let's continue through the video and see if he makes any other blunders.
The Levites were not perfect and could not remove our sins forever. If they were perfect, we wouldn't need to look for a second ministry. But since the Levites were imperfect and temporal, we look for a second, Yeshua Messiah, our perfect mediator, who has removed our sins forever. Hallelujah. Now, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8 through 12 is quoting Jeremiah 31, which I go into detail in my video titled, What is the New Covenant? So please check that out to understand the meaning of Jeremiah 31.
Nothing much to respond to here. I agree with what he's saying about the Levitical priesthood, which is, according to Hebrews, the only priesthood mentioned in the Torah. Jesus' priesthood is not according to the law. As for his mention of the citation of Jeremiah, I'll leave that to the side, but if you watch his video, here is a playlist of 3 videos going deep into the new covenant and how it relates to the other covenants. I'll put that link down below as well.
Now we get to the popular verse, Hebrews 8, verse 13. In that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. A Sunday Christian reads this verse and thinks it says the Mosaic covenant with its Sabbath and kosher laws are becoming obsolete and vanishing away. But what it really says is a new priesthood has made the Levitical obsolete. The Levitical is growing old as our mediator and vanishing away, which we know now is right when the destruction of the temple occurred in 70 AD, and the Levites lost their duty as our mediator. And the author of Hebrews is saying, do not worry, for we have a better mediator that removed our sins forever, Yeshua Messiah, our high priest, according to Melchizedek.
Well, he did it again. What it really says is the priesthood vanished away? Well, let's look at that. Quick, what do you think we'll find? If you guessed no mention of priesthood or ministry, you were correct. Yet again, John inserts a complete fabrication into the text to tell you what it really says. It says here, in saying new. This verse is often translated with covenant inserted by the translators, but not always. The Lexham English Bible says, in calling it new, and the Young's literal translation says, in saying new. So once again, we've caught John misleading his viewers about the Greek text. As with the previous example, we have the absence of a noun, not the presence of the one John would like to be there. We'll come back to this as well at the end, but we still aren't done with John's video.
Hebrews 8, verse 1. Now this is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens.
Hebrews 8:1. The literal Greek here for main point is kephalion, which means some. Obviously, the term is being used figuratively, and main point is a fine translation of it, but it shows us something. Do you see that this is Hebrews 8:1? Does it strike you as odd that John has waited until here, near the end of his video about Hebrews 8, to first mention the first verse of the text? He didn't do that by accident. For his theological goals, it fits better at the end of his discussion than at the beginning. Problem is, the author of Hebrews didn't have the same theological goals as John. Let's look at the Greek of this text. See how it starts. The sum, now, of the things being spoken of. A sum is either a simple amount, or when working a problem, the final result. When you count, at the end you have a sum. This is why most translations render the verb about things spoken of in the past tense. Now this is the main point of the things that have been said. The first word of the verse indicates that the following statement is going to be a conclusion, namely that we have a high priest seated at the right hand of God. Now, John likes this conclusion very much. It fits his argument. The problem is, it's the conclusion for the wrong chapter. Remember what I pointed out at the beginning. It is chapter 7 that goes into great detail on the Melchizedek priesthood and Jesus. And like you might expect, the author sums up his teaching in chapter 7 with this statement found in 8:1. This statement looks backward, not forward, as John would like it to do. And that's why John waited until now to use it. 8:1 would be the perfect concluding verse for chapter 8 if only the author of Hebrews taught the same thing John does. Since he does not, John has to move the text around a little bit. No harm, right? All right, let's let John finish, and we will look at what's really happening here in Hebrews 8.
So to conclude, this chapter has nothing to do with the Sabbath fading away or the kosher laws vanishing away. For these laws are eternal, just, and true, and truth does not change. Psalm 119, verse 142. Your righteousness is righteous forever, and your law is true. Please check out this topic from a video made by 119 Ministries titled, Is the Mosaic Covenant Obsolete? Hebrews 8:13. This helped me out a lot, so please check it out. And please leave your thoughts below. I enjoy reading them. Thank you and shalom.
John's conclusion is not really connected to this passage, but I will point out that the statement that God's righteousness is forever is a reference to an attribute of God, not a reference to commandments. It is a common assumption among Torah folks to try to make all the references to God's righteousness to be references to the Torah. The reason for this is simple. They want to be able to say something like this, that the Torah is eternal, but they don't have any clear texts that actually say that, so they need to twist something that doesn't say that. As for the statement that the law is true, I have no problem with that. All Scripture is true, but that doesn't imply that all commandments found in Scripture are both universally binding and never changing. It seems John himself agrees with that statement when he says the things he does about the priesthood, that it should pass away and that sacrifices have been replaced by the sacrifice of Christ. It is incumbent upon Torah observance folks to prove that specific laws are still in effect after a change in the covenant. Now, having addressed the clear errors of the video, do we have good reason to believe that the two verses John attempted to change actually do refer to covenant in the text? Let's take the second one first, since it's much easier to establish. Verse 13, without inserting anything, says, "In calling it new, he has made the first obsolete." For starters, the Torah person does not save his position by claiming that what is new is Jesus' priesthood as opposed to the new covenant. he really gains nothing because it is still an admission that the law has changed. And not just a few laws either. Conservatively, much more than half of the commandments found in the Torah concern priests, the temple, sacrifices, all of that. It seems clear from John's video that he thinks all of that is now obsolete. Does that square with how he argues for the keeping of other laws elsewhere? How eternal are God's commandments if Jesus makes most of them obsolete by means of his priesthood? According to Hebrews 7, the Levitical priesthood is the one that is according to the law. Jesus' priesthood is not law, but rather based on an oath given after the law. Hebrews 7, verse 28. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. This is a reference to Psalm 110, verse 4. God swore with an oath to make the Messiah a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So no matter what, something about the law has become obsolete. And any argument that a commandment continues simply because it is written from Exodus to Deuteronomy fails. You must show more than that. Now, aside from that problem, is there a problem with interpreting Hebrews 8:13 to be a reference to the priesthood of Christ? Yes, absolutely. If you just read the whole passage in context, you get to hear 8:8 begin citing Jeremiah's new covenant prophecy. In that prophecy, God declares that he will make a new covenant. He then goes on to describe ways that it is different from the one God made at Sinai. That citation ends, and the very next phrase is, in calling it new, he declared the first to be obsolete. Who called something new in the context? God called the new covenant new. Nowhere in Hebrews does the text refer to Jesus' priesthood as new. In fact, other than one verse, 10:20, which refers to the new and living way Christ inaugurated for us, every other reference in the book to something new is a reference to the new covenant. And contextually, it is absolutely impossible for this verse to be referring to anything but the new covenant. The very first and only reference prior to this verse to anything new is the mention of the new covenant in verse 8. The citation is then immediately interpreted by saying, in saying new. The author is specifically calling out this word in the citation and interpreting it. It cannot refer to anything else. Do you remember when John mentioned scholars?
And take the time to listen to scholars.
Well, he didn't actually cite any, did he? He didn't mention any names. And now we can see why that's the case, since no scholar makes the mistakes in his video. Well, I will go ahead and cite a scholar who is not only a scholar, but also one who agrees with much of what John says about the Torah, Tim Hegg. In his commentary on Hebrews, even though Hegg does believe that 8:6 ought to be seen in reference to ministry, he does not say the same about 8:13, since it is just too much of a stretch. Of course, Hegg seeks to minimize the impact that this has on his conclusions as much as he can by prefacing his admission with a string of translations that insert covenant, as if this were illicit. Here's the quote just after this string of translations. Thus, those many English translations, which include the word covenant in this verse, do so as a matter of interpretation by the translators, not as based upon anything in the Greek text itself. But I would agree that the word new in this verse is pointing back to its use in the New Covenant texts just quoted from Jeremiah, and thus the addition of the word covenant with the word new by English translators gives the proper sense. If you really want to see this for yourself, just read the whole chapter all at once. The New Covenant prophecy is introduced, then cited, then interpreted. There's just no way to shoehorn priesthood into 8:13, as John argues, let alone pretend that this is the proper sense of the Greek text. Now, what about 8:7? Well, it isn't as strong a case as 8:13, but that's like saying someone jogging toward the finish line isn't going as hard as someone sprinting toward the same line. Yes, one is stronger, but both are going the same way. As we saw earlier, there isn't a rule of Greek grammar that indicates for us which of the two options, ministry or covenant, is pointed to by that pronoun phrase, that first one. So to know which one it is, we have to make a contextual case. Which one fits what the author is saying in context better? So what happens when we let the immediate context of this verse inform what we should interpret it as meaning? First, let's remember that before we get to verse 7, verse 1 tells us that the sum of the discussion up to that point is that we have a great high priest. That is the introduction to the concluding thoughts on the priesthood for this section. And like he did in chapter 7, the author once again points out how Jesus' priesthood is not based on the Torah like the Levitical priesthood. Hebrews 8, 4 and 5. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For see, he says, that you make all things according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. Jesus is a priest according to the heavenly things themselves, not the shadow like what Moses set up. On the heels of this verse, we come to verse 6, where we see the transitional statement where the author is going to shift from talking about the different priesthoods to the different covenants. Hebrews 8:6. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. Aside from just trying to connect this verse to the next one properly, what does it actually mean? Jesus has obtained this more excellent ministry, this better priesthood, based on something more fundamental, by the fact that he is the mediator of a better covenant enacted on better promises. It isn't just that there's a new priesthood. What makes this new priesthood more excellent than the old is that it is based on a better covenant than the old, with better promises than the old. Now, let's read the next two verses, but I want you to see this flow. Verse 7 is the one John and other Torah folks argue so hard is not about the Mosaic covenant, but rather the Levitical priesthood. Then verse 8 introduces the first line of the Jeremiah prophecy. Let's read all three verses together, not broken up where we're missing context. I will read verse 7 literally, without inserting covenant into it, so you can hear the flow of the text without biased language. Remember, we just read how Jesus' priesthood is not just serving the shadow, and now we read this. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first one had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. What are these three verses about? Isn't it clear? They're all about the new covenant. The word covenant is not inserted into verse 6 or 8. It's there in the original. So the author mentions covenant both before our question verse and after. Meanwhile, he does not mention priesthood again for quite some time. And as we saw, the rest of the chapter is a citation of the prime New Covenant text from the Old Testament, followed by a clear reference to the New Covenant and how it makes the first one obsolete. And do you see how the text here in verse 7 contrasts that first one with what is better, second, and new? What John doesn't acknowledge is that the entire book of Hebrews never uses new or second to refer to Jesus' priesthood. It is always about the covenant. Now, Jesus' priesthood is contrasted with the Levitical in other ways, but not in this chronological way. Yes, the old priesthood is called the former one, but Jesus' priesthood is not described as the new one or the second one or anything like that. In fact, just to solidify this, let's look at one other place in the book where covenant is often inserted. Hebrews 9:1. And just so we get the context, let's look at the verse preceding it 8:13. This should sound familiar. Once again, I'll cite it without the insertion, though we've clearly established that 8:13 is referring to the same new thing that 8:8 referred to, the new covenant. Hebrews 8:13. When he called it new, he has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Now even the first had regulations of divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. And this is almost exactly the same construction that we had in 8:7. Only this time, the preceding text has not mentioned the priesthood or temple ministry since way back before the big New Covenant citation. And what did 8:13 say again? It said the first has been made obsolete. The first covenant, not the first priesthood. The whole context is talking about covenants. It is a colossal stretch to say that Hebrews here would be somehow contrasting a new covenant with an old priesthood. These are separate categories, and there is just nothing in the text to make verse 13 about a new priesthood. So there's just no getting around this for John. Hebrews 8 is clear. The new covenant has replaced the old covenant. Since it is new, the first is obsolete. That is just what Jeremiah promised when he said that it would not be like the one given at Sinai. And of course, the text doesn't have to mention specific commandments like the Sabbath or kosher laws for these things to have implications for those commandments. We shouldn't have to twist the text or pretend the Greek says something it doesn't in order to make our theology work. We let the text determine our theology, not the other way around. I hope this has been helpful for you.